The night Emily Carter took her last breath, the house seemed too quiet, like it was holding something back. Mark told the 911 operator he woke up and found her cold. He spoke softly, almost rehearsed, like he already knew the ending of the story he was telling. But the room didn't feel peaceful. A lamp was knocked slightly sideways, the bed sheets twisted, and Emily's face looked tense, not calm. Something about the scene made the air feel heavy, like the truth was still trapped inside those walls. And while Mark insisted she slipped away in her sleep, the shadows around that bed whispered something else. Something darker, something no one noticed at first. But what really happened in those quiet hours? And more importantly, what was Mark hoping no one would ever find? When officers arrived at the Carter home just after dawn, Mark stood in the living room with his arms wrapped tightly around himself, rocking slightly, like he was rehearsing grief instead of feeling it. He answered every question quickly, almost too quickly, repeating the same line again and again. She didn't wake up, but Detective Nolan noticed the small things, the way he avoided eye contact, the way his voice wavered only when he mentioned himself, never Emily. The house carried a strange tension, like the night had been louder than he wanted anyone to believe. Emily's body was already taken for examination, but something about Mark's calm didn't match the fear that usually follows sudden loss. Something wasn't lining up, and Nolan felt it in her gut. While the officers photographed the bedroom, Mark repeated the details of the night, but each version carried tiny differences. He claimed he fell asleep around 10. Then he said maybe 11. He insisted Emily was fine before bed, yet he couldn't name a single conversation they had. Detective Nolan stayed quiet, letting his story unfold into knots. The bed looked anything but peaceful. Sheets were pushed to one side and a lamp leaned at an odd angle. Emily's phone lay on the floor, screen cracked. Nolan didn't touch anything. She only observed, letting the room speak louder than Mark ever could. Emily's sister, Claire, arrived mid-morning, her face pale with shock, as officers gently held her back from the bedroom. She could barely speak, but managed to tell Nolan that Emily sent her a message the night before. One that sounded scared. Claire's voice shook as she explained. Emily rarely asked for help, and when she did, something was wrong. Nolan listened carefully, her suspicion growing stronger with every word. A peaceful passing didn't fit with a woman who sounded frightened just hours before she died, and Claire's trembling hands made it clear. Emily didn't go to sleep, expecting to never wake up. By noon, Emily's body reached the medical examiner's office. Dr. Lena Bishop studied the initial notes without emotion, but the more she read, the more her brow tightened. Died in her sleep rarely comes with bruised wrists, or marks near the mouth, or signs of force beneath the skin. She didn't need to open the body to know this wasn't natural. But once she began her work, the truth wouldn't stay quiet any longer. What she was about to uncover would shatter Mark's story completely, and shift the case from a tragedy to something far more sinister. Dr. Lena Bishop began the autopsy with calm, steady movements, but within minutes her expression shifted from routine focus to quiet concern. Beneath Emily's skin were small, deep bruises that didn't match a peaceful death. She noted faint marks around the mouth, pressure that suggested force, not sleep. Emily's wrists showed signs of gripping, as if she fought back, even if only for a moment. Bishop paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle before continuing. The room hummed with the low buzz of fluorescent lights, but the silence in her mind grew louder. Nothing about this looked accidental. Nothing about this said natural. And whatever story Mark rehearsed so smoothly that morning, it wasn't possible. Emily's final moments had been anything but calm. Detective Nolan arrived at the medical examiner's office just as Bishop finished her initial notes. The two women stood beside the table, the air cool and heavy with the gravity of what they were discussing. Bishop explained the bruising patterns, the subtle signs of pressure that no sleep could create. Nolan listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail, like pieces of a puzzle she already suspected existed. The idea that Emily simply didn't wake up fell apart with every word Bishop spoke. Nolan stared at the marks, imagining the last struggle Emily endured. A woman who sent a frightened message the night before didn't suddenly drift into a peaceful death. Someone was with her. Someone who didn't want her to speak again. Later that afternoon, Nolan returned to the Carter home to walk through the scene again with fresh eyes. Now that she knew Emily had fought back, every detail carried a different weight. The twisted bedsheets looked like signs of struggle, not restless sleep. The cracked phone on the floor felt like a silent cry for help. Nolan imagined the final argument, the fear in Emily's voice, the moment the situation turned violent. She moved slowly, letting each small detail speak louder than Mark's carefully practiced lines. In the quiet of the bedroom, the truth felt close, like the walls themselves were remembering. Mark was brought into the station for a follow-up conversation. Nolan sat across from him, her expression unreadable as he retold the same story she'd heard that morning. But now, with the autopsy findings in her pocket, every word he spoke sounded thinner, weaker, almost desperate. He claimed he slept deeply. He claimed he heard nothing. He claimed Emily looked peaceful when he woke up. Nolan let him talk, her silence pressing harder than any accusation. When she finally mentioned the bruises, Mark froze for a breath. A single, subtle moment, but enough to confirm everything Nolan suspected. His mask cracked. Back at the medical examiner's office, Bishop finalized her conclusion. Emily Carter did not die in her sleep. She was smothered, her final breaths taken by force. The bruising patterns, the pressure marks, and the internal evidence painted a clear picture of a violent struggle. Nolan received the report just after sunset, standing outside the station as the streetlights flickered on. She read every line slowly, feeling the weight of Emily's final moments settle heavily in her chest. The truth was no longer a theory. It was fact, and with it came a new reality. Emily Carter had been murdered, and the person who tried hardest to appear innocent might be the one who took her life. Detective Nolan began reaching out to the people who knew Emily best, hoping to understand what happened in the weeks leading up to her death. Her first stop was Emily's close friend Mia, who worked with her at the school. Mia's voice trembled as she described how Emily had grown distant, quieter than usual, like she was carrying something heavy she couldn't talk about. She said Emily avoided going home early and stayed late at work, something she never used to do. Then Mia mentioned one detail that made Nolan pause. Emily once joked that Mark's perfect husband act was only for other people to see. But it didn't sound like a joke anymore. And with every new story, Nolan felt the gap between Emily's public smile and private fear widening into something unmistakably dangerous. Inside Emily's classroom, Nolan took a slow walk through the space that once held laughter and small voices. The room was bright and colorful, but it also carried an emptiness that felt heavier now. On Emily's desk sat piles of graded papers, a coffee mug, and a tiny photo of her smiling with her students. Nolan noticed a planner tucked beneath a stack of worksheets. Inside it, several days were marked with scribbled notes, short phrases like "too tense," "need space," and one that stood out sharply: "talk to someone." These weren't notes from a woman expecting life to stay the same. They were notes from someone searching for a way out. Later that day, Nolan stopped by the Carter home to speak with a neighbor who had called the police months earlier about a loud argument. Mrs. Doyle, an older woman with a sharp memory, recalled hearing shouting the night before Emily died. She remembered Emily's voice shaking, followed by a heavy thud that made her freeze in place. She never saw them fight outside, but inside the walls of that house, something darker lived. Her hands trembled as she told Nolan she wished she had done more, wished she had called someone sooner. Nolan thanked her gently, understanding the regret in her voice. The truth was becoming clearer, threading together through the people who cared enough to speak. Back at the station, Nolan read through old incident reports and stumbled on something she had hoped she wouldn't find: Emily had once made a late-night call to a local hotline, reporting fear of her husband. The note was brief, lacking detail, but it was enough to confirm the pattern. Nolan leaned back in her chair, staring at the report as evidence piled up around her. Emily had tried to reach out, to warn someone, to escape quietly before things got worse, but something forced her to stay. Something, or someone, who didn't want her to leave. The final piece came when Nolan met with one of Mark's coworkers, a man who seemed hesitant at first, but once he started speaking, the truth poured out. Mark had a temper, sharp, sudden, unpredictable. He complained often about Emily being too emotional, and once admitted they argued about her wanting more independence. The coworker described a moment when Mark slammed a door so hard the office shook. Nolan felt a weight settle on her chest as she wrote down each detail. Emily's fear, the bruises, the arguments, the silence. They weren't isolated pieces anymore. They were a story, one that Mark had worked hard to hide, and one that was finally unraveling. Detective Nolan sat in the quiet interview room replaying every detail. The bruises, the late-night message to Claire, the neighbor's report of shouting, and Mark's shifting timeline. Everything pointed to one night spiraling out of control. She imagined Emily trying to leave, her voice shaking as she packed a small bag or reached for her phone. She pictured Mark waking up or catching her in the hallway, anger rising fast, pushing the argument into something violent. Nolan could feel the tension of that moment. The fear Emily must have felt. The panic in Mark's eyes as he realized he couldn't control the situation anymore. And somewhere between rage and desperation, everything changed. Emily didn't just fall asleep. She fought. And she lost. With a clearer picture forming, Nolan reconstructed the night step by step. Emily had likely tried to leave, maybe after sending that final frightened message to Claire. She may have grabbed her phone, her planner, her keys. Mark, already restless from the tension in their marriage, confronted her. An argument erupted, growing louder, sharper, more desperate. Emily wanted freedom. Mark wanted control. Somewhere in that struggle, Emily stumbled or pulled away, leaving marks on the bed and knocking over the lamp. Mark's panic mixed with fury, leading him to push her back onto the mattress. Nolan imagined Emily gasping, trying to scream, trying to breathe. And Mark, terrified of losing her, pressed harder instead of stepping back. Nolan brought Claire back to the station to ask about Emily's plans. Claire revealed something new. Emily had told her the night before she was done pretending. She wanted to leave the marriage but feared Mark's reaction. Claire's voice trembled as she admitted Emily never came out and asked for help directly, but her words had become softer, more careful, like she was walking on a thin line at home. Nolan wrote everything down, her pen pressing harder with each phrase. Emily wasn't just thinking about leaving, she was preparing to. And that was the kind of decision that could turn a controlling partner dangerous. As evening settled, Nolan returned to the medical examiner's office for one final review of the physical evidence. Dr. Bishop showed her the bruising pattern again, clear signs of pressure around the mouth and nose. Emily had been smothered by someone strong enough to pin her and desperate enough to silence her. Bishop explained that Emily struggled for several seconds, long enough to leave deep marks beneath the skin. Nolan felt her chest tighten as she imagined Emily fighting to breathe, her fear rising while the man she once trusted held her down. It wasn't quick. It wasn't peaceful. It was an act of control, taken to its most violent end. By the time Nolan returned to her car, the sky had darkened into deep blue. She sat behind the wheel, letting the weight of the reconstructed timeline settle. Emily's fear, the argument, the struggle, Mark's panic, and then the silence that followed. Nolan felt a surge of anger, not just at what happened, but at how easily Mark tried to bury the truth under a calm voice and a fake story. She knew now without question that Emily didn't die by chance. She died because she tried to break free. And tomorrow, Nolan would bring everything to the table and start pulling Mark's lies apart one by one. Detective Nolan started the next morning with a stack of evidence laid out across the interview table. Phone records, timelines, autopsy details, neighbor statements. Every piece pointed at one truth. Mark walked in trying to look composed, but his eyes kept darting around the room like he was searching for a way out. Nolan didn't waste time. She began by calmly asking him to repeat the events again. His story sounded the same as always, but the confidence behind it was fading. When Nolan placed Emily's phone records in front of him, showing the message to Claire sent late that night, the color drained from his face. His practiced calm cracked around the edges, revealing something far more telling. Fear. Nolan shifted to the autopsy next, sliding the report slowly toward Mark. She watched his eyes move over the pages before he tried to look away. His voice cracked slightly as he insisted he didn't know what the bruises meant, but Nolan pressed. She spoke with controlled calm, explaining the marks on Emily's mouth, the bruises on her wrists, and the signs of a struggle. Each word seemed to push Mark further back into his own panic. He wiped his palms on his jeans, glanced toward the door, then swallowed hard. He knew Nolan had him cornered, and the room felt smaller by the second. His story was collapsing. Then Nolan revealed something Mark never expected. Security camera footage from a gas station a mile from the house. A car matching Mark's had been seen driving at 1:47 a.m. Long after he claimed he was asleep. Mark froze, his mouth half open as he failed to form a believable explanation. Nolan leaned forward and quietly asked why he left the house that night. The room seemed to hold its breath. Mark rubbed his forehead, shaking his head as he muttered something about needing air, but the excuse fell apart before he even finished saying it. His timeline was shattered now, exposed by his own movements. With the lies exposed, Nolan asked about the argument. She didn't accuse him out loud. She simply laid out the evidence and waited. Mark's breathing grew uneven, his voice trembling as he tried to deny everything. But every denial grew weaker, thinner, like he couldn't hold them together anymore. Nolan told him gently that Emily had been planning to leave. The words hit him like a strike. His face tightened, his shoulders slumped, and for the first time the anger slipped through the cracks. He whispered that Emily didn't understand, that things got out of hand. And in that moment, Nolan knew she had him exactly where the truth lived, between desperation and guilt. Finally, Nolan placed Emily's planner on the table, opened to the page where she wrote, "Need space." Mark's head dropped the moment he saw it. His voice, once smooth and confident, cracked as he whispered that he didn't want her to leave. He said he just wanted to talk, that things went too far, that he lost control. His words came out in broken pieces, each one heavier than the last. Nolan didn't rush him. She let the confession spill out naturally, shaping itself into the truth she had known all along. Emily didn't die in her sleep. She died in fear. And Mark's lies had finally reached their end. The room fell into a thick silence as Mark stared at the planner. His breathing was shaky, his shoulders trembling as if he was holding back a storm. Nolan didn't push him. She simply waited, letting the weight of his own guilt settle around him. Finally, Mark whispered that Emily wasn't supposed to leave. His voice cracked as he said he felt everything slipping away and didn't know how to stop it. He talked about the argument starting small, then rising fast, fueled by jealousy and fear. The anger had flashed through him before he could think, and by the time he realized what he'd done, Emily wasn't breathing. Nolan watched him break apart piece by piece, the truth spilling out with every breath. It wasn't an excuse. It was the moment he could no longer hide from what he had done. Mark lifted his head slowly, eyes red, voice unsteady. He admitted that Emily told him she wanted space, maybe even time apart. He said he felt like he was losing control of everything. His marriage, his image, his sense of who he was supposed to be. He described grabbing her wrist when she tried to leave the room, then pushing her back onto the bed during the argument. The anger in him exploded, and he couldn't pull it back. His voice dropped to barely a whisper as he said he held her down because he just wanted her to stop yelling. As the words left his mouth, He pressed a shaking hand against his forehead, realizing that the person he became in that moment was someone he never thought he could be. Nolan asked him gently, "What happened next?" her voice calm enough to keep him talking. Mark swallowed hard and looked toward the floor as he described how Emily gasped, how she struggled to push him away. He said he panicked when her movement slowed, telling himself she was just exhausted, that she'd be fine. When he realized she wasn't breathing, he froze, too afraid to call for help. Instead, he tried to stage the room, smoothing the sheets and moving objects around so it looked like she simply fell asleep beside him. He confessed in a trembling voice that the lies were easier than admitting he caused her death. Nolan wrote everything carefully, her heart heavy as she pictured the final seconds of Emily's life through his broken words. As the confession continued, Mark's voice weakened, each word sounding like it took more strength than he had left. He admitted leaving the house in the early morning hours, driving aimlessly until he could think straight. He said he kept rehearsing what he'd tell the police, repeating the same line until it sounded almost believable. She just didn't wake up. He talked about the guilt gnawing at him, the fear of losing everything, and the terror of facing what he had done. Nolan listened quietly, letting the silence between his sentences settle like a mirror, reflecting the truth. When he finally looked up at her, there was no mask left, only the raw, heavy truth he had tried so hard to hide. By the time Mark finished speaking, the room felt still, like everything had finally settled into place. Nolan closed her notebook gently and explained that what happened next wasn't about fear or panic. It was about accountability. Mark nodded slowly, tears sliding down his face as if he already understood. He didn't resist when officers entered the room. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply lowered his head, hands trembling as they placed the cuffs around his wrists. It was the first honest moment he had shown since the night Emily died. And as Nolan watched him being led away, she felt a quiet sadness for Emily's final moments, but also relief that her truth was finally spoken aloud. News of Mark's arrest spread quickly through the quiet Richmond neighborhood. Emily's friends gathered for a small memorial at the school where she taught, leaving flowers, handwritten notes, and tiny drawings from her students taped to her old classroom door. Detective Nolan stood at a distance, watching people come and go with heavy hearts. She thought about the gentle woman who tried to hide her fear, who stayed quiet for too long, who reached out for help in small, uncertain ways. Nolan felt a deep ache, knowing Emily's final moments had been filled with fear. But she also felt a calm resolve. The truth had been uncovered. Emily's voice, once ignored, now echoed through every person standing there in her memory. Inside the school, Emily's co-workers gathered in her classroom, sharing stories that showed who she truly was. Patient, funny, steady, always ready to help a child who needed company. Nolan listened to them talk about how Emily tried to be strong, even when she seemed tired or distracted. They remembered the kindness she carried everywhere she went, the way she always made space for others, even when she struggled herself. As Nolan stepped out of the room, she felt a renewed promise forming inside her. Justice wasn't only about punishing the guilty, it was about honoring the victim's life, letting the truth restore some of the dignity that fear had taken away. Meanwhile, Dr. Bishop prepared her final report for court, ensuring every detail of Emily's injuries was documented clearly and precisely. She moved through her office with the calm focus of someone who understood how much these findings mattered. Emily's story now lived in numbers, diagrams, and observations that couldn't be twisted or denied. Bishop paused for a moment, looking at Emily's file, feeling the quiet sorrow of a life cut short. Her work didn't bring Emily back, but it brought truth into a place where lies once tried to rule, and that mattered. In the courthouse days later, Mark sat before the judge with the same pale, hollow expression he wore the night he confessed. Nolan watched from her seat as the charges were read. Second-degree murder. His lawyer tried to frame it as a moment of panic, but the evidence was too strong, the confession too clear. Mark barely lifted his eyes as the judge denied bail. Nolan felt no triumph, only the steady satisfaction of knowing Emily's truth had finally been spoken in a room where it mattered most. Justice wasn't fast, but it had arrived. On the evening after the hearing, Nolan drove to a quiet overlook just outside town. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm streaks of orange and pink, colors Emily would have loved, according to her sister. Nolan stood leaning against her car, thinking about the small decisions that shape a life, and the moments when silence becomes dangerous. Emily never got the chance to reclaim her future, but her story would live on as a reminder to look closer, to listen harder, to notice the signs hidden beneath quiet smiles. Nolan breathed in the cool air, letting the day settle. Justice had begun. And Emily's voice, once trapped in fear, would never be ignored again.